Welcome to the Loanable Funds. So on your piece of paper right now, what I'd love for you to do is title it the Loanable Funds Market and draw just a basic supply and demand graph. We're going to label the graph real interest rates on the y-axis. Then on the x-axis, we're going to do quantity of loanable funds. We're going to label the supply line the supply of loanable funds. The demand line is the demand of loanable funds. Then where they intersect, we have the equilibrium real interest rates. And then we have the equilibrium quantity of money that is available for loaning. So what's a loanable fund? A loanable fund is money that can be borrowed and loaned out. So you spent Unit 4 learning about money and banking. Now we're going to take it a step further and dive into the impact of borrowing money and also the impact of putting money away in a bank. So the suppliers of loanable funds, we're going to start with them. Who are the suppliers of loanable funds? So I'm just going to draw that in parentheses over here. Who puts money into banks so that banks have money that can be loaned out? Households. Another group that puts money into banks is businesses. Businesses put money into banks. Households put money into banks. They are the suppliers of loanable funds. The other group that helps increase liquidity in banks, provide cash in the vault for the banks to loan out, are our nation's central bank. In the United States, we refer to our central bank as the Federal Reserve. You learned in Unit 4 that when the Federal Reserve buys bonds, they replace bonds that are in banks' assets with cash. And that is part of the supply of loanable funds. There's another group that's part of the suppliers of loanable funds. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these people when we do Unit 6 on international trade, but these people are foreign investors. And I'm just going to fix my parenthesis a little. That's going to bother me a little bit because it's not quite big enough to fit all of these. I should have known that. So when you think about the suppliers of loanable funds, I want you to think about it in a less fancy way, that the suppliers of loanable funds are just people or entities that are putting money into banks, because the money that banks have available to loan out is only there because a household or a business, the central bank, or a foreign investor has put that money in the bank. So who are the demanders of loanable funds? It sort of feels a little bit redundant, but households. You know, right now, I currently have money that is sitting in savings accounts, in 2 different savings accounts. And I also have money that I owe because I have loans. So it is possible for many households to have both money that they're storing away in banks for their own savings, which makes them a supplier, and then money that they're borrowing as well. Just like households, another group, businesses. Businesses borrow money too, small business loans. They borrow money to do things like build their store or to take on a new venture, invest in a new product or expand their product line. Businesses take out loans too. The third and final group that takes out money from banks is something called the government. And when we say government, I'm going to put a little star next to it because I really want you to hear this. This is when the government borrows money in order to fund projects that are part of their regular fiscal spending or discretionary fiscal spending. So for example, you know, a good example that's local is the construction of the Barrington Middle School. The Barrington Middle School is not something that the town had $60-something million just sitting in a bank account and they could just cut the check to the contractors, the architects, the designers, so on and so forth. That money had to be borrowed. So the town of Barrington borrowed the money for the middle school, and the taxpayers are paying off those bonds that the local government borrowed over a series of years. And then once that's paid off, that hopefully that tax burden will be reduced. In another example, you could look at something whenever the government would increase spending. So, for example, in the United States, if you want to look at a federal example, when we had the government spend money on COVID relief, whether that was increasing unemployment benefits or stimulus checks to American families, or provide personal protective equipment for hospitals or schools or other government agencies, they had to borrow money to make that happen. So incidentally, when we're talking about the government, we're talking about fiscal policy. We're talking about the federal, state, and local governments that need to borrow money to achieve their spending measures. We're not talking about the central bank. Okay? All right. So when households put more money into savings, the supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the right, and we're going to see real interest rates decrease. When businesses put more money into banks, we're going to see the supply of money shift to the right. When the central bank buys bonds, we're going to see the supply of money shift to the right. When foreign investors decide to put their money in American banks because there's an incentive there, whether it's because they want to cash in on higher interest rates in the United States, that's going to influence the supply of loanable funds. The demand for loanable funds will come when households, businesses, or the government is demanding more money in order to afford whatever it is they want to buy. So when you see something in the newspaper or in the media that says, household borrowing higher than ever, you can see, oh, that means that we are shifting the demand for loanable funds to the right. We're going to see higher interest rates in the US. When businesses borrow more money, we're going to see higher interest rates. When the government engages in borrowing money, we're going to see higher interest rates. So those were shifts to the right. Those were increases. I think it's probably obvious that you also could see decreases in the supply of loanable funds. If households are putting less money in banks, if businesses are putting less money in banks, if the central bank is selling bonds and taking money out of banks, if foreign investors are pulling their money out of banks, then you're going to see the supply of loanable funds shift to the left, and that's going to increase interest rates. If we see the demand for loanable funds decrease, because we see stories that say things like households borrowing less, businesses borrowing less, the government is borrowing less, we're going to see the demand for loanable funds shift to the left, and we're going to see real interest rates fall. This is particularly important as we get into our next unit, Unit 5. Let me just erase this. Unit 5 hinges primarily on fiscal policy, and government spending is a really big piece of that. And more often than not, the government borrows money when they are in a deficit. I should rephrase that. More often than not, the government doesn't have the money that they need, and we're in what's called a budget deficit. Therefore, the government has to borrow the money in order to reach their spending goals that, from a moral, ethical, or goal-oriented place, the government has said, we need to spend X amount of dollars, we don't have it, therefore we're going to borrow that money. And in the beginning of Unit 5, we're going to learn about a topic called crowding out. And I'll give you a sneak peek of it here, but I'm not going to tell you everything because that's another conversation for another time. But when the government has to borrow money, this drives up interest rates. And typically the government is borrowing money because they want to increase government spending. They want to increase aggregate demand. But what happens is because they've borrowed money, they've increased interest rates, which is going to discourage households and businesses from borrowing money, which is going to decrease aggregate demand. And there's a little bit of a problem there with that because those two things don't really mesh. So again, that's another conversation for another time, but it is something that I feel compelled to share that we're talking about the loanable funds market. So loanable funds, it's just a fancy way of saying how much money is available to be loaned out due to households, businesses, central banks, and foreign investors putting money into banks versus how much money people are borrowing. This is about the relationship between savers and borrowers. The savers are the suppliers of loanable funds. The borrowers are the demanders of loanable funds. And that is the loanable funds market graph. And we're going to follow this up with some practice because we have to learn by doing. But this is the graph in general, and now you're ready for the next step.